From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with the public mood on Iraq. Despite the diplomatic moves, there's a growing sense of pessimism. Our latest ABC News Washington Post poll shows that 75% of Americans think there will be war in the Persian Gulf. Our poll does show the public overwhelmingly in favor of Mr. Bush's decision to send Secretary of State Baker to Iraq. 90% approve of that. But more than half, 53%, do not think it will do any good. The negotiations about those face-to-face talks are well underway. And here's our national security correspondent, John McWethy.
Twice over the weekend, America's highest-ranking diplomat in Baghdad, Chargé Joe Wilson, met with Iraqi Foreign Ministry official Nizar Hamden. Wilson presented the U.S. proposal of talks between the two countries, and the Iraqis asked questions. So far, the only thing that has been officially agreed to is that the talks will include representatives of only the U.S. and Iraq. President Bush had originally proposed that the U.S. would bring along such coalition partners as the Kuwaitis and Saudis. But when the Iraqis then said, fine, we will bring the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Bush administration backed off. To sweeten the offer to talk, Secretary Baker promised over the weekend for the first time that the U.S. would not attack Iraq if Iraqi troops are withdrawn from Kuwait. Today, another enticement. Baker met with the foreign minister of Kuwait just after the State Department had emphasized that if Iraqi troops would get out of Kuwait, other good things could happen.
The Kuwaitis themselves have said since August they would be more than glad to meet in The Hague to discuss the very issues that Saddam Hussein or his people say drove him to take this aggressive action.
Iraq's ambassador to Washington was glowing with optimism today.
We can strike a common base in order to arrive at a peaceful solution, which would be the interest of everybody.
When President Bush made his dramatic offer to send Baker to Baghdad, he said it was not to negotiate, but to warn Saddam Hussein that the U.S. was ready to go to war. Yet in just 3 days' time, it's become clear that the agenda is not that limited. John McWethy, ABC News, the State Department.
More from our poll. Nearly two-thirds of those we asked, 63%, said that if Saddam Hussein has not withdrawn from Kuwait by January the 15th, the U.S. should go to war to force him out. And 66% said they do not think the economic sanctions alone will do the job. Well, now that the Bush administration has won a United Nations endorsement to use force if necessary, and now that Iraq and the U.S. are going to sit down and talk about war or peace, the administration did think it was finally safe to answer some of Congress's questions in hearings on Capitol Hill. Here's ABC's Bob Zelnick.
Secretary Cheney and Chairman Powell had to answer critics who say the huge military buildup in the Gulf has prematurely put the U.S. on the course of war. Cheney said force may be necessary soon because economic sanctions alone may not force Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait.
If the president were to ask me today, can you guarantee that these sanctions will work within a year or two, the answer is no, I cannot.
Now, it seems to me that's almost a Chicken Little approach to our current policy. The sky is falling in, and there's only one option, and that's war.
Cheney said the embargo could be doing more harm than good, hurting countries that trade with Iraq. Senator Nunn said the Saudis should devote more of their windfall profits from higher oil prices to help those countries. Democrats argued that the deployment of 400,000 troops to the Gulf strains available manpower to the point where the administration will have to fight soon or bring them home. General Powell conceded those forces could not be sustained for long. He suggested a war could be won quickly with a combination of air, land, and sea power, not air bombardment alone.
But my job and the job of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the commanders involved in this operation is to make sure that if it is necessary to go to war, we go to war to win.
Of course, the administration's analysis left Chairman Nunn unconvinced.
I would like to see the Secretary do as good an analysis on the cost of war as he's done on the downside of continued sanctions.
The administration would like a show of congressional support to strengthen its hand for talks with Iraq. But Senate Democrats are holding back, fearing the administration has already proceeded too fast and too far on the road to war. Bob Zelnick, ABC News at the Pentagon.
President Bush has begun his long-awaited visit to South America. He arrived in Brazil early this morning at the start of a 5-nation tour, which will also take him to Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela. While Mr. Bush continues to pay attention, close attention, to the situation in the Gulf, On this trip, he wants to emphasize mutual growth with South America's newly emerged democracies. ABC's Britt Hume is with him.
President Bush's meeting with Brazil's youthful President Collor had been postponed once by the Gulf crisis. Though that was far from the main subject here today, it is never far from the president's mind. And he could be heard discussing with Collor the impact of higher oil prices on the world's economies. Collor said it would cost Brazil $5 billion a year.
That's why people say to me, well, this can go on and on and on, and I'm saying no.
The president's main purpose here, though, was not to argue against delay in the Gulf, but to cheer Brazil on as it struggles to reform its economy and to open it to foreign goods. Mr. Bush is pushing a plan to make the whole hemisphere a free trade zone.
Change will not come easily. Economies, now dependent on protection and state regulation, must open to competition. The transition for a time will be painful.
The countries Mr. Bush is visiting this week have moved strongly in recent years toward open economies and democratic governments. But there was a loud echo from the past today in Argentina, where Mr. Bush will go Wednesday. A faction of the military seized a barracks and spent much of the day shooting it out with government soldiers. The government appeared in no danger. Indeed, Argentine President Menem called Brazilian President Collor to assure him and Mr. Bush that the uprising was not major. As of tonight, the president planned no change in his scheduled visit. Britt Hume, ABC News, Brasilia.
By late this evening in Argentina, all of the rebels had in fact given up. With all of the tension in the Persian Gulf, a trip to South America may be distracting for the president. But for the countries involved and for the U.S. as well, there is a lot at stake for the future. In the 5 newly emerging democracies he visits this week, the president's encouragement for very difficult economic reform is important. In Brazil, where the gulf between rich and poor is as great as anywhere in the world, the president advanced the idea of helping to reduce the country's staggering foreign debt if Brazil will open its notoriously closed domestic markets to American products. The president also talked about the environment. The Amazon rainforest is essential to both South and North America. The president suggested that some of the interest payments on Brazil's debt be put into an environmental trust fund, which could be used to help protect the rainforest. When the president gets to Argentina, he may hear that today's mini uprising in the military was connected in part to economic dissatisfaction. Nowhere is the president likely to have a first-hand look at the grinding poverty. But he will be reminded time and again that if only the U.S. would make it easier for South Americans to pay their debts and to compete for U.S. investment capital, in the long run, South Americans with money in their pockets will be customers for U.S. products. In Uruguay and elsewhere, the president will get a warm welcome simply for showing up in South America. It is 30 years now since Dwight Eisenhower was the last American president to make such an extensive tour. In the past, South Americans have had trouble even getting North America's attention. In Chile, most of the 80s were lost to military rule. The current oil crisis risks creating unrest here, and President Olwin still has not managed to get the military under civilian control. So in Chile, without appearing too paternalistic, which Latin Americans resent deeply, President Bush will try to nurture the new democracy. Finally, the president will stop in Venezuela, something of a model for the whole region. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the Western Hemisphere and has been pumping extra oil since the crisis began in the Persian Gulf. But even though Venezuela has a long experience with democracy, bad economic times often mean unstable political times. The Venezuelans believe that Mr. Bush's ultimate goal of eliminating all trade barriers is the most far-seeing one ever imagined for the hemisphere. So the president's trip is important for a couple of very essential reasons, telling South Americans that they matter very much while reminding his audience here at home that this is, after all, a marketplace of 300 million people. In a moment, the other news. A collision between 2 planes at the Detroit airport. The airlines say that at least 20 people may have died. The earthquake that never happened. And finally this evening, the American composer Aaron Copland, who has died.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, brought to you by Tylenol.